We're now going to shift a little to the very tough boots on the ground work of decarbonizing multifamily buildings. As you all know, Local Law 97 is pressing. Summers are getting hotter. The economics of electrification are, shall we say, complicated. This session that we're going to hear from right now is about all of that. It's about what's actually working, what's not, and where we're seeing breakthroughs. We have a fantastic panel. I'm going to hand it over to our moderator, Danielle Manley, who is Associate Director of Policy here at Urban Green Council, where she works on advocacy, stakeholder engagement, and analysis on all of our state and city policy initiatives. Danielle, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Chris. It was really nice to follow that conversation just now between you both. I'm Danielle Manley. I work on the policy team at Urban Green. I feel really lucky because every day I get to work on advancing climate solutions for people. And I'm really excited to be moderating this session because we're focusing on the multifamily space. And our conversation with the panelists, who I'll introduce in just a second, is going to cover the crossover of electrification, affordability, and resiliency. And I'm joined by four people who collectively represent a really strong cross-section of what it takes to decarbonize New York City's multifamily buildings. So I will say, I guess, as we did before, we'll start at the end. So we've got Kelly Ziegler, who is the Department Manager of Mass Markets and Energy Efficiency and Building Electrification Programs at Con Edison. We have Adam Romano, the Senior Director of Workforce Development and Training at the Association for Energy Affordability. We've got Jen Leone, who is the Assistant Commissioner and Chief Sustainability Officer at the New York City Department of Housing and Preservation and Development. And finally, we've got Kelly Westby, who's the Managing Director of Building Operations, Decarbonization, and Efficiency at Stephen Winter Associates. And so just before we get started, we're focusing on multifamily buildings because that's where the majority of New Yorkers live. We focus on multifamily buildings in so much of our work at Urban Green. 2/3 of all of Local Law 97 properties are multifamily. Many of them are old. More than half of them were built before 1940. And space heating alone accounts for over half of the energy that they use, the majority of which are heated by central steam systems. And so modernizing these buildings is one of the most important and complicated challenges that we have in New York right now. And it's not just because decarbonization in multifamily buildings is a climate story, it's also, as we just heard, a housing affordability and quality of life story. It's about innovation and design and engineering, and it's also a resilient story. And Local Law 97 is pushing this whole sector to move, and it invites the practical question of how do we get there without leaving people behind? So when we talk about switching from steam heat to heat pumps, we're talking about retrofit costs that are real and significant for owners who are often operating on thin margins already. We talk about what's happening to someone's heating bill. And when we talk about improving access to cooling in multifamily buildings as our summers get warmer, we need to talk about whether people can afford to run that equipment even if we have it in place. But what we're going to cover today is the good news. There's real solutions that we're working on. Many of the people in this room are part of that. Engineers, contractors, policymakers, advocates are all working to move this market. And we have new and exciting things like window heat pumps that didn't commercially exist 5 years ago that are now heating real apartments in New York City. So we're going to dig into that today. I am going to move over to this seat. Okay, perfect. Mic is on. So I'm going to start with Local Law 97, not because this whole conversation is going to be about that. There's a lot more to multifamily buildings than Local Law 97, but it's the thing that's driving the market right now because we have a range of experiences. We have those that are already implementing plans. They've made their plans and they're doing it. There's those that have made plans, but they're not going according to plan. And then there's others who, they're just still figuring things out. So I'm going to start with the practitioners on our stage here. Adam and Kelly Westby, from your perspective, what are you actually seeing in your day-to-day work with the multifamily buildings that are coming to you for help with Local Law 97?
Sure, I can go first. So we at AEA we deal primarily with affordable housing. So that's 99% of our work across the country. And we have a lot of long-term clients. So a lot of our clients have been with us for 20, 30 years. We've been working with them on their buildings and their portfolios. So they've known, obviously about 97. I run our workforce, operation at AEA. So we've trained a lot of folks about what this actually means and what you need to be doing and thinking about, so you're not reactionary. But a lot of them are they are moving forward, right? They are doing the work. They understand it needs to get done. They see the benefits. They understand there'll be savings. A lot of it is about finding the funding for them to be able to implement the measures, right? So we also run a downstate weatherization assistance program, the WAP program, and we try to braid as much of the funding from the federal government, state governments that we can to help them, achieve all of the savings and being able to implement the energy conservation measures they need to implement. So some of that takes time and it takes effort. It's a lot of staging, it's a lot of sequencing, right? So that, has been the bigger issue is we need a little bit more time to help them, work through their plans.
And I think I'd add there's sort of two things we think about in terms of Local Law 97. There is a huge filing effort, and then there's decarbonization. So we're all in the game already, unless I guess you're lower than 25,000 square feet, in which case maybe you're sitting on the sidelines with popcorn. But for the rest of us, I think we're in it. And we went through the first round of filing, and it was an intense exercise. I believe, and maybe Laura will speak to this later, but there was about 90% compliance in terms of filing. Maybe she'll correct me there. And so we're all looking at the data. Owners are understanding where they're starting, and I think that's important. And then there are much fewer, I think, buildings that have actually done some decarbonization work. Now, the important part is that for 2024, I think 90% of buildings started in compliance with the decarbonization threshold. So they didn't actually need to do work to comply yet. So we are seeing a lot of great early examples and demonstration projects, and I think there's opportunities to learn from a wide variety of early projects. But I think when people ask the question of whether people have been working on doing Local Law 97 work, they don't necessarily mean the filing, they mean deep energy retrofits, and there we're still in the very early stages.
Is there anything that either of you want to add from your perspectives, Jen or Kelly, on Local Law 97 so far?
Sure. So I think I can trump Adam here and say I work 100% on affordable housing. Most of our projects that come through, so HPD, we finance new construction and retrofits. A lot of the projects are, in their mid-cycle phase. We've given them funding. They're like in that theoretically static phase, and most of them are subject to Article 321. So the prescriptive measures, and there's some action happening. Laura will, I think, talk about that as well. But one place we're seeing serious action, and I think we're way ahead of the curve, is Mitchell-Lamas. Like everyone I think knows, those are huge campuses around the city, subject to Local Law 97 starting in 2035. That's when the emission limits kick in. But we are a housing finance agency, so we see these buildings when they have major capital needs. So here we are, it's 2026, and these buildings are already thinking, what do I need to do now so that I don't face penalties or I'm not crippled by penalties when they start rolling in? And it's really, really hard because we will not see these buildings for another 10, 15 years. And there's still not a lot of really good data out there, right? Costs are still high and people are still confused. So we are in a really active stage of trying to figure out how to really do this on a huge, fast scale. And right, we're a housing finance agency. We are not engineers ourselves. So it's just really interesting. We've got a lot of support from NYSERDA and DOB and others to try and think through what does this really mean at that scale and over time.
Thank you. And then I guess, Kelly, turning to you, as buildings start to move on this work, they're looking for incentives and assistance for paying for the work that happens. Based on what you've seen at Con Edison and with the multifamily incentive programs, what really is the biggest bang for the buck in multifamily building decarbonization right now?
So I'll say maybe I'm on the flip side of some of the larger projects that a lot of you are involved in. And we're just seeing hundreds of buildings come through our program doing relatively minor interventions that are helping them reach their local Law 97 goals for the short term. One of the major ones that we are focused on is weatherization. And it's really the cornerstone as we start to think about this broader trajectory towards building decarbonization. Weatherization can happen now. It's a relatively simple job that can be done, and it's being done on hundreds of buildings across the city, and we're seeing those buildings save on the order of 15% on their heating energy usage each year. So it's real, it's now, it's happening, and we're excited about it.
I think I can build on what Kelly's sharing there. I think maybe 5 years ago, I think we forgot everything we knew about energy efficiency and then got really excited about heat pumps, the shiny object in the room. And I love heat pumps just as much as you all, but I think there's some really great opportunities that maybe scale back a little bit in terms of the cost. So when we're talking about the biggest bang for our decarbonization buck, and full disclosure, I have an engineering background, so I'll share a few other maybe optimization-focused things. I think we have started to see a resurgence of retro-commissioning, which I'm personally excited about. We have a retuning program in the Mid-Atlantic that's kicking off. Mass CEC is heavily invested, so not just in New York, but in other places. I do think retro-commissioning might have gotten a bad rep because Local Law 87 didn't necessarily result in the citywide savings that we were hoping to see from that program alone. But there are real opportunities in buildings today. I also like to shout out you talked about steam systems. I think boiler is a dirty word sometimes these days, but steam systems are 80% of multifamily buildings, right? And there's thousands of two-pipe steam systems, and we can optimize them on the order of $1,000 an apartment and save 10 to 30% of your energy use. So that's pretty significant. And to Kelly's point, if we're looking at 2030, we're looking at things that can get us to 2030, maybe a third of buildings, this is a UGC study too, actually, a third of buildings is already compliant. There's another 25% of buildings that need to reduce less than 20%. So the measures Kelly's talking about, the optimization measures, those can get you that. Those can get most of the buildings the way till 2030.
Right, and I agree. Those are the no regrets things you can do. It's only going to benefit you, and it's going to benefit both on the heating side and on the cooling side. Folks really think about weatherization as only load reduction for heating, but it's going to help, for load reduction in the summertime, and it's permanent load reduction in a lot of cases if we're doing these larger weatherization measures, insulation, air sealing. I would argue that it might be a little bit more difficult than a lot of folks think because you are crawling around in the building, you have to get access, you have to go in, all of the tops and bottoms of the building. So it does take a skilled workforce, and to do it effectively, that's the other thing. I think a lot of times weatherization measures may just be thrown in as, we're going to do this, we're going to do air sealing, but there's a difference between doing it and doing it right. And I think, you can cause more harm in a lot of cases if you're not doing it correctly with moisture and other things that could pop up from, improperly installed measures. So I feel it's nice to get back to the basics, like to Kelly's point. I think it's good for us to be able to think about that as energy efficiency as decarbonization.
Great. And Jen, are you also seeing the same thing with in HPD? The biggest bang for the buck, is it weatherization, or are you focusing on electrification?
I'm going to say that we have a bigger bang for the buck, but only for a really small population. We have a program called the READY program at HPD. NYSERDA has provided, over this program and to the state housing agency, more than $100 million of funds that we can integrate directly into our financing capital stacks. So when projects come to us and are fully replacing their heating system, which is really common when they're coming back to HPD for funding, we have a really opportune moment to capture the electrification best use cases, right? It's not all of them, for sure. It's the ones that are doing the whole heating system replacement and where we've carefully assessed the economics for the whole project life cycle. And then we can integrate up to $35,000 per dwelling unit to make sure the projects can get over the finish line. So that's a really big but super limited bang for the buck.
And I think that brings up a great point too, that the answer is it can depend. It depends on the existing conditions of the building. It depends on access to financing. Whatever the best solution is can be building dependent.
Yeah, and I think, for Local Law 97, maybe not the folks in this room, but there's a broad perception out there that, you have to electrify right now in order to meet the law's requirements. And I'm hearing from this conversation that's not really where people should be focusing first. But how should owners be thinking about when to electrify if they don't have to do it right now? We know that might be the goal long term, but how does it fit in with everything else that the building needs to be doing? And maybe I'll start with Kelly or Adam again.
Sure. I mean, I think it depends, right? I think that's the other, that's the most famous answer, right? It depends. It does depend, right? It depends on a lot of different factors. Is your boiler at the end of useful life? We have each building has its different, sort of criteria and different situation. But I think, there are new technologies that are coming out as well. So there might be a benefit of waiting a little bit to see some cost reduction, to see more demonstration projects go out there, to see more lessons learned, right? To see what happens with rates, right? To do these lower cost measures first to get you where you need to be, and then figure out, okay, down the road, it's not like kicking the can, but it's saying, okay, well, I may want to be a little bit more strategic about how I electrify as opposed to just rushing to it right away.
I agree with that. And I think, the answer is the time is right when it's right. Based on a lot of the factors that you've talked about, right? Is your boiler at risk of failure? Are you in the process of replacing it? Oil customers have much better economics. I know I paid $6 for gasoline to fill my car the other day and almost fell out of the driver's seat. I can't imagine what heating oil bills are going to look like for buildings this winter. So I could see a lot of folks looking at those economics just with the broader geopolitical situation and asking, maybe there's a different alternative for me.
Any other thoughts on the capital stack?
Yeah, I think we're echoing, honestly, the panel this morning. So I think it's similar to the commercial side that at a recapitalization event and at the end of useful life, that's really when we need to be thinking about these metrics and making the business case, setting up the plan early on so that when that event happens, you're prepared with the business case for potentially electrifying. And I would also bring up, just to represent the market rate side of things, it's not a large portion of the multifamily buildings that have central cooling plants, but where they do, I saw a great presentation by a friend of mine who's in the audience about electrifying central chiller plants that were on that were steam absorbers, and that can be a fantastic electrification opportunity. That's not something that we ever talk about. And so thinking about when the system reaches the end of the useful life, maybe the boiler, maybe the chiller, maybe the distribution system itself, but there's lots of systems going on in the building, so I guess it goes back to, it depends.
Great. And one last question before I move on to the next topic. Kelly, for you, Con Edison has started its new phase of incentives and heavily favoring weatherization. Could you let folks know what's new about the program and the approach? And I think it's kind of echoing the things we're saying on stage here, but what is the new trend for the incentive program?
Certainly a lot more emphasis on weatherization than we've seen in prior years. Important when you think about staging these types of projects in buildings, weatherize first. That should be the principle. Before you start thinking about electrifying, weatherize first. It's going to allow you to size your equipment much better to the building's needs. It's going to help you save when you do try to operate that equipment. Weatherize first is the message I will leave you with. We are, these programs, New York State has been a real thought leader and putting the money where the ideas are leading us. Con Edison alone will be investing about $2.1 billion with a B in energy efficiency programs over the next 5 years. That is a huge investment in this city's future in decarbonizing our building stock. And I encourage anyone who knows anyone who owns a multifamily building, even your home, if you live in our service territory, to get in touch with us and see what options are available to you.
Great, thank you. And so we talked a bit about the work side of things, but if we move over to the human and resident side, we just heard a really amazing conversation on how New Yorkers are struggling with energy insecurity and paying their utility bills. In some cases, when a building moves from central heat provided by steam to heat pumps, tenants who have never paid a utility before or didn't see one will suddenly get one on their electric bill. And so how is cost shifting being navigated, both in the policy space to make sure that the most energy burdened aren't all of a sudden bearing a huge additional cost, and also from a technical perspective? I might start with Jen.
So I think we can assume that outside of the space of regulated housing, it's probably happening in a way we don't really think is positive. And I'm sure people have heard of this, cases where, residents in any kind of multifamily housing, and we've seen a lot of this in gentrified areas, maybe not while a tenant is living in a building, but moving into a building, not realizing they have to pay for their own heating, maybe hot water also, and all of a sudden receiving really huge electric bills because they're in buildings with poorly installed heat pumps or electric resistance heating, but we're not really talking about that here. That's obviously worse. But we've seen a lot of cases of complaints and tenants, wow, why am I paying $1,200 in February on my electricity bill? We're much more hopeful in the landscape of regulated housing, and I'm talking about rent-regulated and rent-stabilized housing, which has very strict rules about cost shifting. You basically can't do it without HCR's permission. And because once you're shifting costs around in affordable housing, you have to adjust rents, right? Because there's a cap on how much of income an affordable housing resident can pay. 30% of their shelter rent, so utilities and rent. That's not always the perfect metric, but it's a layer of protection. For us at HPD, we have even more policy requirements layered on top of that. So when a project comes in, we have to be really careful, whether it's a new construction project contemplating tenant-paid heating or hot water. And HPD is, if anybody has come across our electric heating policy, we're really stringent on when and where we might allow that, right? We also have to navigate the rent stabilization rules. And the reason we do this, even though we are funding projects at a time where you can adjust rents and keep rent plus heat under that 30% mark, we don't feel yet that we have all of the data in place to be sure that it's a good idea, even if it's technically possible and possible from a policy standpoint. So our approach has been, let's do this really carefully. We've created the means and mechanisms to allow for tenant-paid expenses and cost shifting, but we rarely use them yet until we feel like we understand how this will work. We understand whether it's a good idea when we don't have a really solid ground on utility escalation. And that's how we've been handling it from the housing standpoint. But one other thing I just want to point out, because at least in the affordable housing context and housing affordability, we're not only worried about cost shifting, it's really important too that for building owners of affordable housing, that their bills are also contained, right? People are hearing a lot of stories about nonprofits and mission-oriented housing owners that cannot pay their bills. Their cash flows are negative. And if we start having those situations too, either rents will go up or buildings will fall out of affordable housing context entirely. So again, it circles back to the concept of efficiency. Like if we cannot reduce the energy use, then we shouldn't be electrifying anyway. It's just too risky.
And I can take us to a couple of technical examples just to get a little bit into the weeds on this question. And we're actually kicking off a market study of options for cost shift prevention on the unregulated side. And then we're also working on a demonstration project on the rent regulated side to demonstrate maybe one option for preventing this cost shift. And I want to talk, there's a couple of different things. So there's shifting the cost of heating to the tenants in a direct metered building, or shifting the cost of cooling back to the owner. So both are considered cost shifts. And then I think also just the complexity of what's the current metering situation. We talk about it as if it's one problem, but it's actually a pretty complicated problem that depends on the system and the meter configuration, and of course, the affordability status of the building. But on the technical side, full disclosure on these technical solutions, we're sort of exploring and thinking about them now, and hopefully I'll have more to say in a year. The things that have come up. So one of the example projects, I have an initiative called Show Me the Data I'm working on with Daphne, thank you very much, and Michael Reed in the back there. So I had to give a little shout out to it, I see you laughing. So we collected some information on post-retrofit performance of a couple of different buildings. And one of the buildings went to a central heat pump plant, so with a hydronic distribution system. So in that case, you're not shifting the cost of heating to the tenants. In fact, the owner is absorbing the cooling costs. And what they shared with us was the idea of trying to apportion cooling costs to the tenants was so expensive, I'd rather just pay for it. It was like, I'm not gonna spend $1 million on an apportionment system. So that's one option. And that's with a central system. Another option, here's a split system, so multi-split system, one outdoor unit, a couple heads in the apartment, and the outdoor unit is connected to the house meter. They have sub-meters on all of those units. They actually installed sub-meters everywhere. Super excited about that data. So the sub-meters allow them to charge the tenants for any usage outside of the heating season, outside of the regulated time for heating. So in theory, if you have a cold September 30th, then the tenant is paying for heating, and if you have a hot October, then the owner is paying for cooling, but in general, you've sort of kept the costs where they were before. Another solution that we're seeing and that we're exploring a little bit more is how can you actually power one package terminal heat pump with two sources of power. One is the house and the panel, and switch when it's in heating mode versus in cooling mode. So in cooling, you charge the tenant, and in heating, you charge the owner. So these are different technical solutions that we're exploring right now, and we'll see the results over the coming years. Although actually, the first two are in process right now. I think there's another solution.
It'd be the same, yeah. So we have the same thing. We've been approaching it that way, is not changing the distribution system radically, right? We've been sending water around buildings for over 100 years, whether it's steam or hot water or chilled water. So can we utilize that as a heat transfer medium and, just upgrade the distribution, right? Put in, low temperature radiation, right? Utilize, 140, 120, 130 degree water on design day, and then install a heat pump to be able to, go ahead and provide that heating, right? And there's benefits, there's comfort benefits, right? We're not overheating buildings. We're putting in thermostatic control. We're improving distribution efficiency because now we're not sending 180 degree water out to the building. We're doing a more aggressive outdoor reset. So there are, solutions there where we're maybe not changing things too radically. Now cooling, we would convert back to, window air conditioners, but we'll put something in that is much more efficient. The efficiency of window ACs have gone up dramatically in the last couple of years. You can buy, inverter-driven, variable speed, window ACs that work very, very well. But that has kind of been our approach to it is be cautious, to Jen's point, and try to use the existing distribution system as much as we can. And that project, we're talking about is up in the Bronx. It's going to go online this winter.
And another thing that we're seeing is a discussion around going from direct metering to a master sub configuration. So there's a few folks exploring this opportunity. Now, there's a whole separate discussion of whether owners want to be, utilities moving forward, but I think from that perspective, the projections are, and I like to talk in terms of actual real results as well as Dana and the folks on the panel earlier today. The projections were that you could save 30% by going from a direct meter and having all the costs of each individual meter to going to a master sub situation. And what I have seen anecdotally is a project where we were looking at the data. One project was direct metered, stayed direct metered. The cost of electricity went up 30% over the 4 or 5 years. Another building switched to master sub and the electricity rates stayed the same. So unfortunately, in today's reality, staying the same is actually saving, but because electric costs are going up across the board. But it is also important to keep in mind that gas rates are going up as well. I think we got off the point.
Yeah, I think you did. That was great. And I guess Kelly Z over there, can you talk a little bit about the heat pump rate that Con Ed has been implementing recently?
Part of the dynamic Kelly's describing is just a function of the design of rates that are given to an individual residential tenant and the design of rates that are given to a large multifamily building. And what we've done at Con Edison is make those multifamily building rate designs available to residential customers through our steady use rate. We're seeing about 90% of customers who have heat pumps save on the steady use rate. Would just really encourage anyone who finds themselves living in a building that has heat pumps to transition to this rate, or if you move in that direction at your home as well, it's almost certainly going to benefit you. Absent a couple of other considerations like whether you have solar and whether you have an electric vehicle. So we'll walk you through all of those situations. And then for multifamily buildings, if you are moving forward with heating electrification, just make sure as part of that process you've confirmed you're on a demand-based rate. Most multifamily buildings in our service territory are already on that rate, but some smaller buildings may not be. So it's really important to manage your electricity bills.
And I think that's a significant shift in the industry. It used to be that energy nerds like me, if you are reducing energy, then you don't have to worry about rates. You use less, and it's of the same fuel, so it's not a big deal. It gets much more complicated today, and understanding, being able to bring together, I think that collaboration framework that was brought up earlier today, to be able to collaborate across utilities, practitioners, and owners, I think is really critical.
Yeah, and do residents, do they have to have participated in, I'm assuming most are using the incentives to do some of this work, but in order to qualify for the rate or start to use it, how can people apply for it? What do they have to do?
Just 1-800-75-CON-ED. You do not need to have participated in our program. Anyone can sign up for it. You don't even need to have a heat pump to sign up for it. A lot of customers are on that rate voluntarily. It saves you money if you're willing to not stack up your usage. So if you're willing to run your washing machine a little later in the evening when you're not simultaneously washing your dishes, you can save as a non-heat pump customer on the rate if you're willing to manage your usage in a slightly different way than you would normally do so.
Great, thanks. I'm gonna do a bit of a segue here. We've been talking about electrification for improving buildings, but also electrification is a straightforward way to get cooling to New Yorkers. Cooling vulnerability is one of the biggest climate impacts in New York City. And with summers getting hotter right now, some of the electrification work we're talking about can overlap with this, but are heat pumps going to be the thing that gets New Yorkers access to cooling in multifamily buildings, or how does that intersect with what we're talking about right now? Jen.
So, having spent a lot of time thinking about Local Law 23, which just passed, and that is the whatever you call it, right to cooling bill, or it has a lot of names. If anybody's been really tracking it, it requires air conditioning in new construction, which most buildings were already doing. HPD certainly got ahead of that one a while back. And then it allows tenants to request an air conditioner from their landlord if they don't have one. That is its own thing. It's a way of getting a piece of life-saving equipment into a building. I think the bigger question that you're trying to ask really is, will this be another trigger for heat pump installation? I think there are certain cases where people are maybe on the cusp of, should I do my local Law 97 electrification now or in the future? It might be one more argument to say, I'm either going to be asked to put in air conditioners, maybe not, but it's just one more trigger, I think, for people to think holistically about a heating and cooling system. That's one thing. However, there's also something in the law that says if the building owner controls and pays for the cooling, there's an indoor air temperature requirement, which could actually be a disincentive for owners to have central cooling in a building, right? Because always on, and ideally they were doing that anyway, but it's hard to know how that will play out. But one more thing, and I'm sorry, I read Powerless. It was a great book, by the way. If you didn't win it in the raffle, you should read it. Really powerful. But the biggest problem with cooling right now, for the more likely case of tenant-paid cooling, is people who are lower resourced cannot afford to turn on their air conditioners. And that's just something that we all have to keep in mind. You can have an air conditioner. You're going to have to pay for it under Local Law 23. Local Law 23, but if you can't afford to turn it on, it's not having the benefits that we need.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right and undercuts a lot of this discussion. I think to add on top of that, just from some of the examples that we've seen, and I think it's probably telling that a lot of the electrification examples we've seen in multifamily are master metered buildings, so that means something here. I think what we have seen, though, is in some of these retrofits where for example, the central air-to-water heat pump with hydronic distribution. Now we have, you can't have cooling whenever you want it. Most of these are ending up being two-pipe systems, although in luxury market rate buildings, they'll go to a hybrid fan coil unit with a water-cooled AC. Anyway, I went too far there. But so you might have heating and cooling. So anyway, in these central systems, we are actually seeing, I think there's been a little bit of a narrative that electrification is increasing costs overall. But on some of these examples, we were seeing 30 to 40% energy savings overall. This was with a hybrid system, so it had a central air-to-water heat pump, but it also had a gas backup boiler. That was something Dana alluded to earlier today. We're seeing 30 to 40% savings, and in some cases, 18% cost savings. Now, all of this it has to be projected. It's based on an adjusted baseline, and we can kind of nerd out about that later anyways. But I think the important thing is that it's not true that, that all of these retrofits are resulting in overall additional costs.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think some of the master meter projects we worked on, one of the ones we showcased and, showed me the data, there was a tremendous savings. It was 40% savings. And obviously we started with a two-pipe steam system that was inefficient, but we went to an in-unit heating and cooling option, a heat pump option. So I think as the technology advances, it becomes easier to install in-unit systems that can interface with 120, 15 amp receptacles. I think that's going to make, the movement, towards providing cooling a lot easier, because in the past we would have to run 220 lines and we'd have to upgrade panels and we'd have to look at service, and like all of that adds tremendous cost to, with conventional systems. So I think as technology progresses and we start to see things that can work with our existing infrastructure, I think absolutely we're going to see more of that.
And I think to speak to your point of new through-wall AC units, like they're a lot more efficient than what we had before, but we're also seeing that in a PTHP, a package terminal heat pump retrofit, we saw 10 to 30, I know that's a wide range, but 10 to 30% reduction in peak demand in the cooling season. And what that tells me is that these systems are really performing better than the alternative, especially with the variable speed compressor. So we are seeing benefits on the cooling side through electrification. I mean, to your point, is this particular bill gonna push electrification? I don't know, but we do see cooling benefits to the electrification work.
Great, and your point there actually is a good segue to the next question. I think a lot of people are really excited about some of the innovation and the technology that's happening in this space. And I think, many folks in this room might be eager to hear about the through-wall units and the window heat pumps and what lessons are we learning from that technology right now. I think each of you may have some experience with this, but Kelly or Adam, what you want to talk about the work that you've been doing or any of the data we're seeing from this?
Yeah, I mean, the one project I just mentioned, that was a through-wall unit that we actually utilized the existing AC sleeves in this building to be able to move the air in and out of the through-wall unit. So we insulated those sleeves, which also had a big building envelope improvement, right? Because those not insulated, there's a big hole in your wall, right? There's holes in our walls. So we helped with reducing. Building load reduction with that as well, but there are challenges, right? We had to interface to that existing ACC, so we had to customize the bracketry that we were going to use. Some of the units did require 220 volts, so we had to bring that over from the panel. So we had to hire an electrician. There have been some. We're going to talk about this later, but on the tenant engagement side, now there are filters that have to be changed. They have to be cleaned. So there's now a little bit more work, for the resident that they have to be able to go ahead and maintain this unit, and building operations staff have to understand how to address no heat issues or complaints. Now there's 150 of these units in the building, right? 3 per apartment on average, right? And a 50-unit building. Now there's a lot more equipment that has to be serviced on a regular interval. So those are some of the things we're learning. Like some of the window heat pumps, and I'm rambling, so cut me off if you want to interject. Some of the window. Okay, sorry.
I was just going to jump in on this maintenance point,
go for it.
because I
Yeah.
think this is a really interesting point about this technology. It does require more maintenance. And if you don't maintain it, you got trouble. Yes. And if you have a problem with your heat pump, like it's not providing enough heating, or you're seeing it go into something called defrost mode, you got to fix it. You got to fix it. Because I can't tell you how many customers we hear coming back complaining about really, really high bills because they let it go, never called somebody. Some of these units are still under warranty, and they just didn't have them fixed. So, and I know we've had some conversation about split issues between a landlord who's responsible for maintaining the system and a tenant who's responsible for maintaining the bills or paying the bills. I mean, I think this is going to be something we're going to have to continue to grapple with, but the maintenance is it's so important.
No, I mean, it's huge. I mean, outside of the installation quality, I mean, that's the biggest variable if we're going to achieve performance. It's going to be, are they maintained? Are filters changed? Are all that happening? Because your point, and if you don't do that, they're just going to operate inefficiently or not provide heat, or they're going to cost more. So we're going to see these cost increases.
And I think the idea of installation quality cannot be underscored enough. There's a really big difference between what tenants are going to pay on their bills, between how comfortable they're going to be in their space, between a well-designed, installed, and operated system and a poorly designed, installed, and operated system. And the only thing I would argue with Kelly about is that actually steam systems do require a lot of maintenance. We just don't provide it to them. And speaking to the retrofit before, replace your steam traps with orifice plates if you have a 2-pipe system. It would be great. I promise. We can talk about it later. But I think the truth is that heat pumps, package terminal heat pumps, fail. VRF systems fail. Steam systems fail. All these systems fail. That's not the question. The question is, can we make sure that we can provide the training, the installation quality as we scale up these solutions? I think we got used to the bad performance of steam systems.
And just to add on the city side, there has been a lot of effort across various city agencies to start thinking about, from a policy perspective, are there ways to enforce maintenance and proper installation, even on these smaller systems that aren't really covered right now, right? There's working groups going on, and this is really, really critical, right? We have a housing maintenance code in the city. Does it talk about maintaining window heat pumps? No. But could it? Yes. And there's a lot of room to make sure that building owners are held accountable for the systems that they put in their buildings. And that's huge. One thing to note is I think the kickoff of one of these working groups was the day I went to visit one of these recently gentrified buildings in Bushwick. And there was a lot of complaints coming in through social media and through our enforcement channels. A group of us went out to see the building and see what's going on. Why are the bills so high? We went out in the backyard and there's just cans of 410A just discarded all over the backyard. And you look at that and you're like, holy shit, like, we don't know what's going on. There's clearly leaks. There's a lack of maintenance. The tenants said, the systems aren't providing heat. They have no information, but that is the one thing we have to really avoid. Also, all the benefits of that electrification wiped out like years ago from the leaks.
By all the refrigerant leaking into the atmosphere, if that wasn't 100% clear. And I think that takes us back to the, this is a little bit of a sore subject. So I think it takes us back though to what Adam was saying in the beginning, which is like, these package systems, these room heat pumps, it's really exciting. It's exciting for a lot of reasons. It really reduces the complexity of installation. It really reduces the amount of refrigerant that you have. And I mean, from what we don't always talk about this or hear this publicly, but I think one of the undertold carbon stories is refrigerant leaks. Like, I think 0% probably of refrigerant is actually reclaimed at the end of the life of these equipment, and so it's all going into the atmosphere. All of your work is completely negated. We could probably have a whole panel on that, but I'll bring it back to the fact that these systems have so much less refrigerant in them and have less opportunity for leaks because there's no field-installed refrigerant piping, which honestly, that's really, really challenging to get right.
And what's great about that as well is that also it opens up the workforce to be able to install these systems. I don't need a refrigerant handling license to install, a unitized system that is either, through wall or, window unit. But if I'm going to install a VRF or a split system, then now I'm handling a controlled refrigerant. I have to be licensed. I have to follow protocol. So, in terms of workforce development, which I think we're going to talk about at the end, it opens up, the avenues for folks to get into this trade.
Great. I'm going to pull in some audience questions that are coming in, and I hope this one doesn't put anybody on the spot too much, but it is the top 3 questions are about this, and while we're on refrigerants, I want to bring it up. There's a local law 77 rule that went into effect on May 15th that adds a lot of guardrails around installing split heat pumps. Our top 3 questions, there's a combined over 50 likes on this question. So can anybody first explain, is anybody on the stage able to explain what Local Law 77 is in the context for A2L refrigerants? And then, okay, this is something the room really needs to think about. And I may call on someone in the audience if you could quickly shout it out. But my understanding is that it's adding a lot of protection in the walls for piping refrigerants when you're installing split heat pump systems. But that might be my very crude way of describing that issue. So
I can add a little piece to that is just the new A2L refrigerants are more flammable. Yeah. So there's a lot of requirements to make sure that that refrigerant, which is more sort of dangerous to people, less dangerous to the environment, but to make sure that it's not leaking and getting into apartments. So there's alarms and monitoring requirements and leak controls, and it's very complex. And I will just say, we stopped seeing VRFs on a huge chunk of HPD projects as soon as this rolled out. And people were like, we can't do this, it's too hard, we don't understand the rules, they're not out yet. And we've seen a big pivot to these package systems.
And I think there's a two-step process too, right? So first is that they needed to ban high global warming potential refrigerants. So there's a phase out of high global warming potential refrigerants, of which 410A is one. And so, so there's a move to A2Ls, which are slightly flammable, I think is what it's called. And so there's a lot more regulation on what you can do with those systems, particularly, this is a very New York City centric set of regulations.
Great, and I think that invites a point that you've alluded to a few times, Adam, but on the workforce development side, you and your work on training and proper installation techniques. Can you talk a little bit about that and both on, how do we make sure it's installed so that refrigerant isn't leaking, but also proper installation so people's energy bills aren't skyrocketing from, this being improper installation. But yeah, what are you seeing in your work there?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think split systems are much more difficult to install, obviously, and a higher degree of, technical know-how to make sure that you're installing a proper flare or you're brazing correctly and you're not getting, and you're not going to have any leaks later on. I think the workforce there's going to be a big demand, as everyone's been talking about. A lot of these units need to get installed, especially if we're doing in-unit work, right? I mean, on average, like 3 or 4 per apartment. So we're going to need a lot of trained, individuals to go in and install these systems and install them correctly. As we mentioned before, the quality really matters. Are you air sealing around the penetrations? Are you sizing them correctly? Are you sizing them to the new load? Because we're doing weatherization work to make sure they're not oversized, they're not going to cycle, and they're not going to, have lower operating efficiency. So there's a huge, workforce need for folks to be educated on how these systems operate. And then on the back end, all the operation side, which I mentioned before, now, tenants need to know how to operate them. They need to know, because it's a new device in their apartment they've never seen before. They're used to interfacing with a radio on the wall, and now they have 3 of these units there that they have controls and they have filters they have to change. They might be making different noises, so they have to understand like what's normal, what's not normal. When do I call for for repair? So it's on that end as well, and making sure that we're going to have those persistent savings over time. So there's going to be a huge need for train individuals.
I also, just as an example, I think you spoke to electric resistance buildings and how much we're going to pay for electricity with an electric resistance building. So does anybody know what the coefficient of performance of an electric resistance building? Yeah. So we also measured the coefficient of performance of a VRF system. It was oversized. This was new. And in the fall, the COP was 1. Overall, seasonal COP was 1.6. So we have to be cautious about what we think is going to happen, what we plan for, and what we're seeing in reality. We're not seeing the performance get to those rated numbers, especially when we're oversizing systems or we have other installation quality issues.
Great. And so with the last couple of minutes here, I do want to bring it back a bit to the people living in multifamily buildings. And our first conversation was about selling decarbonization. But for tenants in their buildings, I think it's kind of a 2-part question. One, what is the lived experience that we can be bragging about, that we want to be getting the message out there to residents for switching to a heat pumps? What are the quality of life benefits? What do they need to know about what's different? And then second is, how can those tenants, and we haven't even touched on co-ops and condos. I know there's some in this space who they have to make decisions together. And what can they be telling the other co-op owners in their building? Like, hey, if we switch to this, here's what we're going to get out of it. So that's a bit of a 2-part question, open to anybody.
I feel like that was not on the question list for sure.
It wasn't.
But what I would say, and we work closely with a lot of residents as well, I think there's a huge difference, and I'll make my answer in 2 parts. There's the tenant experience in a really good electrification project, right? Where they're more comfortable and they have cooling, and if they pay any portion of the bills, they're affordable, right? They don't have drafts coming through their walls because the efficiency piece has been handled. Right, the sizing of the equipment is right. They're not cold in winter. They're not too hot in winter, and all of that, right? So that's one experience, and that's the one that we get when we're really careful about screening these projects, right? And not being too optimistic about what the utility costs will be, and so on. And then there's the bad experience where electrification is happening and incorrect estimates were made, weatherization didn't happen, the equipment is failing during winter, right? It's failing during summer and there's still leaks. And that's what we have to really think about. And the only way we're going to get number one version of good is really being careful about picking the right opportunities and doing it well in the right situations.
I have a short story to tell, but it's not about electrification. It's about tenant experience with weatherization, which is my favorite topic, if you haven't gathered that already. Out on a job with a contractor who's doing excellent work with this new foam technology. Can do wall insulation through a hole about this big, less than the size of a quarter. And they're able to walk through each unit and just patch it up right as they go along. It's fabulous. And what they're sharing, they're usually in larger buildings. They'll be around for a couple of weeks trying to get access to every apartment. And those tenants who at first did not allow them access, come a week later, they've talked to their neighbors who did allow them access, and they are hunting that contractor down. Please, can you do my unit? It is making such a big difference in comfort, in drafts, in sort of making that space so much more livable. So it's only positive on the weatherization side, for what it's worth.
What you shared in terms of overpromising and underdelivering reminded me of a study that we did, feels like a million years ago, maybe it was 2012, and looking at trying to underwrite energy efficiency. And the findings were basically that in looking across multifamily energy efficiency retrofits, the realization rate for energy savings was 61%. So that means for 100 BTUs that we were promising you we were going to save, we were actually saving 61. And that is an unfortunate reality. That was across a bunch of different retrofit types, both heating systems and weatherization work as well. I think it's important to be looking at the data and then seeing how we have to refine. I think a really interesting finding of the study was actually that the biggest indicator of post-retrofit savings was actually not the energy model. I'm sorry, the modelers in the room. It wasn't the energy model, it was the pre-retrofit energy use. So if you're using a lot, you can save a lot. So if you want to narrow in on the key buildings using oil, I think that's one. Buildings using a lot today. I think we need to be focusing on those sorts of things. And then I think to one up the weatherization piece, I haven't necessarily seen in the data that big envelope retrofits are having the payback maybe that we're looking for. But what I have seen is that anecdotally, people are reporting more comfort in projects where I've seen a pairing of weatherization and electrification versus projects that went electrification alone. So that's where I'm seeing the results.
Great, and I think we've got time for one or two more questions. One question before I turn to the last question that I know that you're expecting, Jen, is on,
We didn't prepare for any of these. What are you talking about? It's just brilliant thoughts.
I think a lot of people are nervous about how do they know what work to do when. And there are a lot of cases where each building has its own unique challenges. But through the practices that have been going on over the past couple of years, are there things that are working in most buildings? Are there things that most multifamily buildings should be thinking about doing? They can put it right into their plan, or equipment that works for them, that can reach scale and introduce a little bit more certainty into the process. What aspects are we learning here that are repeatable and predictable, and we can start knowing how much they cost?
I can jump in to kick us off. I'm going to talk about weatherization. When we talk about this moment of affordability that we're in, there are so many wonderfully brilliant people in this room. But for a building owner that is struggling to collect rent and struggling to pay their basic bills, sometimes these projects can feel really out of reach. And I think, as I think about this moment in time and how to really engage, I think you had described the experience of really the majority of New York buildings as not mainstream. And I'd like to challenge that, Because I think the lived experience of the vast majority of New Yorkers is in Class B buildings. It's not in these beautiful buildings that have a vice president of sustainability and have all these wonderful plans. We've got to figure out how do we make these decarbonization improvements accessible and easy. We have to make them seem easy. They need to be replicable. Someone who's struggling to meet their bills needs to look at that as a solution. And so I just, leave that challenge with the group. Certainly one that we are trying to take on in the way we design our programs. How can we make this accessible to every building in New York City, regardless of how they are situated? And weatherization is one of those measures that I think it really has a lot of potential here.
And I think that's a great point. I think, and that's a good business model. I mean, if you could become electrification solution providers, you're providing the whole package, right? You're doing everything, right? That makes it easier for the building owner to say, okay, I'm going to deal with one person. They're going to take us through this whole process. They're going to design it. They're going to help us implement it. They're going to find contractors, right? Becoming a solution provider and kind of pulling that together can really help, ensure success. And then you have the ability to construction manage. You have the ability to do quality control throughout the process. So I think, it might be changing the way that we kind of do things as a smaller, sets of skill sets.
I do worry a little bit about convincing everyone how easy this is. In my experience, smart buildings was going to be so easy and save us all of this money. In my experience, VRF was going to be so easy and be like the golden solution, the silver bullet. And there are no silver bullets and there are no easy solutions, but we need to make the pathways easier. So I completely agree there. I think getting into people's homes and doing retrofit work, even if it's a small hole, is hard. Doing ventilation upgrades, which should be done, that's a great measure. It costs about $1,200 per unit, and it always improves indoor air quality, usually, and sometimes it reduces energy a little bit to a lot, to a medium amount. And we can talk more about the data later, but basically what I'm saying is the measures that actually pay back usually have you going into the distribution system, into the walls, into the roof cavity. They're not the easiest ones, and we just need to be realistic about that's what saves.
Thank you. All right, I am going to, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no.
I'm going to end with a lightning round on a final question. We're sitting in a room full of architects, engineers, policymakers, contractors, students. But many of the people in this room will determine the strategies and implement the plans for whether we reach electrification goals in multifamily buildings. So if you could leave them, this session, what do you want them to leave here thinking about? What should they do differently, starting tomorrow? And we'll go down the row.
I think the most important thing that we need to do today is share. We need to share the data, we need to share the knowledge, we need to share the successes, but we also need to share the failures. If we as an industry, outside of this room, we might otherwise be in competition with one another, but I actually think we need to change that entirely. I think we need to work on our collaboration framework. If we're not learning lessons together, we are not moving the industry forward, and there's only a small number of these deep energy retrofits that have happened, and there's a big number that need to happen by 2050, and so we need to be sharing the data.
I think I totally agree. And when we don't have all of the failures or slight failures or problems, then we can't start to address them on the next round, and they're going to compound forever. But just inspired by all the Knicks talk, I'm going to do a sports one, but I don't know the first thing about basketball, right? But I do know baseball, and I think this is really important. I've said it probably 10 times in 10 different ways, but, when we're thinking about which projects to swing at baseball, don't swing at the bad pitches, right? And be really selective about what you choose to pursue. Because if you know coming in that it's, as an expert in the field, this is a owner who's not going to be able to manage a complicated project, don't sell it to them. It will be a failure. But there are the really good pitches that come in where it's win-win because we have all of Kelly's data and our data and everybody else's data. And those are the ones that we need to start with, are those, the really good strikes that become home runs. So that's my lame sports metaphor idea.
It was very cool.
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree 110%. I think it's being deliberate. It's finding the right projects. Just what Kelly and Jen said. I mean, it's making sure that we're taking our time. We're not rushing through this. We're having good quality control mechanisms in place because we need those wins. We need those wins to be able to then move the market and build momentum and find solutions and take this to scale. So I think as we start off, we need to get those good wins.
Everything everyone else just said, and I'll add to it, to persist. I think we've, heard angst about this moment we find ourselves in. Is this the end of decarbonization? I will say definitively to you, no. Waxman Markey came this close to passing and failed. And yet, we had 10 years of a run of really great work being done in this space. So much work shifted to the states. We happen to live and work in an excellent state. And so take courage. This too shall pass. We need to work through it together. And I don't actually think that many of the things we're talking about today are in conflict with one another. Saving energy and saving money go hand in hand. And I'll leave it with that.
Amazing. I can't think of a better way to end that. A round of applause for our panelists. Thank the four of you.